Let us pray. Almighty God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Kindly sit, please. Today I wish to speak to you on the topic, building a national consciousness. Building a national consciousness. I've chosen this occasion as we observe yet another anniversary of Emancipation to reflect a bit on us as a people. For I believe that emancipation can perhaps be regarded as the archimedean point from which a national or even a regional identity or regional narrative can be written. It would be nothing new. The people of Israel did this with their story. They took the events of the past and formed a national story to which all persons can tap into and find identity. We are yet to do it in this region. And I believe now, even more than ever, is an opportunity for us to seriously reflect. I believe for us as Barbadians, as we celebrate 50 years of nationhood, this emancipation is a good time for us to think about a national narrative. Quite often when we mention slavery or emancipation, the story goes down the way of black and white issues, and we never get much further than that. In fact, just earlier this year, I think late last year, there was a story written in one of the newspapers about why we have a white Jesus in church. And when the story gets to that level, it makes no sense answering. Today I want us to think seriously about our narrative. Naturally, there is some apprehension when we mention slavery, or when persons say we'll have an emancipation service. Persons say, well, why do you need to go back there? We need to go back there because if we do not understand there, we cannot fully appreciate where we are now. Neither will we be able to chart any meaningful course of where we're going. And so quite often, when persons have painful pasts, as we do as a people in this region, the tendency is either to create a mytho-history, a false history to try to block out what is there, or engage in what we call collective amnesia. Pretend it never happened. Don't talk about it, don't mention it, it's not important. And sometimes, when responsible institutions in the community do not engage their past, it leaves the narrative to be guided by persons with ulterior motives. I dare say that slavery and emancipation has sometimes fallen into such hands. All of these things, mytho-history, collective amnesia, or the narrative falling into hands with ulterior motives, have inherent dangers. Mytho-history can create a false sense of identity, false roots, from which we cannot meaningfully build anything strong or anything enduring. I believe it was Marcus Mosiah Garvey who said, anyone without the knowledge of their past is like a tree without roots. The past is important, no matter how painful and dark it may appear to be. On the other side, when we engage in collective amnesia, when nationally and within our homes and within our communities, we tend not to teach and not to speak about things, generations will come up with a false sense of identity. A false sense of identity that has no appreciation for the past, no appreciation for the struggle. And then, when the narrative falls into wrong hands and is dictated by ulterior motives, sometimes it goes down a path that rather than creating unity, create disunity. I believe there are two paths that can come out of such things. One is the path of self-negation. Self-negation because we do not understand who we are as a people. And so we live by his story rather than history. We read the narratives that have been written for us and about us by others rather than shaping our own identity. And nobody really writes anything better about other people than themselves. And so there'll always be that element of self-negation until we own our story. The other path is because of a lack of the struggles of the past, because of a lack of understanding of how we got here. Persons can suddenly believe that the privileges we now enjoy somehow fell out of the sky, with no appreciation for what others would have done to get us here, for no appreciation of what James Weldon Johnson said in the hymn we just sang. We have come through a path that with tears have been watered. We have come treading a path through the blood of the slaughtered. If our young people do not understand this, if they cannot appreciate this, if they do not know their past, their identity, they'll begin and continue to develop a false sense of self, a false identity. If we've learned nothing from the nonsense that is the American political cycle this year, we must now be seeing at least the effect of mytho-histories and false narratives and collective amnesia. Because when we can have a U.S. elected official, the representative of Iowa, Steve King, getting up and asking a serious question, which of the subgroups, so he referred to other people who are not Caucasian, which of the subgroups have ever contributed anything meaningful to history? It is clear that there has been a mytho-history and a collective amnesia. Because if he knew anything about the history of this world, I wouldn't even take him to history books. Just give him the first line of Steel Pulse's song. Remember when we used to live like kings, creators of the alphabet, while the West were illiterate? This year version and a King James version? You don't know that song? Oh, am I going too far here? But even if we take him into history, all the great theorems and the mathematics that we have started right in Africa. Pythagoras' theorem was found on one of the pyramids. So clearly he doesn't understand who he is, poor fellow. And that is what happens when nations create mytho-histories, when they do not teach people who they really are. Because it is only when we understand who we are that we are able to appreciate each other and the contribution that we've all made to this world. We cannot afford to engage in collective amnesia any longer as a people. We cannot afford to pretend it never happened. We must now talk about our history. We must talk about our past. If we pretend that the past didn't happen, then we have nothing upon which we can shape and understand our present and guide our future. In the medical field, and I'm speaking outside of my field here, I see some doctors in the congregation. There's a procedure called debriding. Got it right? Yes. Debriding. It can be very painful. It can cause much pain. But it is the only way that true healing can be brought about. When the murk, when the dead stuff is removed, and then the wound can properly be treated so that healing can take place. It is not a careless hacking away. It is a surgical procedure. A surgical procedure in which the health of the patient must be paramount. It is time for us to do some debriding in this part of the world. It's time for us to cut out the dead stuff. We can no longer engage in collective amnesia. Neither do we need to create a myth of history. For we have a history as a people that I believe is on par with the history of the people of Israel. We have had our journey in the wilderness. We have had our experiences in the promised land where there was such hope, but then things degraded after a while. We've experienced all those things, and we must not hide that they were there. For it is only when this generation and future generations understand the path that we have traveled that they can truly appreciate who they are and what they have inherited. So for us to build a national consciousness in this country and in this region, there must be some debriding. It must be carefully done. I believe that the church is one of the institutions that must lead the way. For it must be done recognizing that just as in the surgical procedure, there can be pain and some frayed nerve vessels. This debriding can produce a bit of pain and some frayed areas as well. So let us set our story in the national context. Who are we? Let's use emancipation as the Archimedes point. We're people who've had a legacy of slavery. On August 1st in 1834, emancipation was proclaimed. But true freedom didn't come until 1838. And even after 1838, you now had the apprenticeship system, which really was another form of slavery. For you had no skills but what you learned on the plantation, so you had to go back there. You had to go back there and accept whatever you got. And then when the Africans started agitating for better wages, the East Indians and the Chinese were brought in. They used to call the East Indians strike breakers, for they came in to disrupt the strikes that the Africans were carrying out. And because of that entry of that group of people into our midst, it created some division amongst the two groups. And the church didn't help. The Canadian Presbyterians in particular came down to this region, especially in Trinidad and Guyana, and started teaching a message that there's a hierarchy of peoples in the world. The Caucasians, then the East Indians, and then the Africans are at the bottom. And this was their Christian message. And so when we see the great divide that still exists in those countries, it is over years and years of indoctrination and teaching that one group is better than the other. And then we had the colonial period, and then the independence and post-independence period in which we're in. All of these have had their varied struggles, their varied complexities. But I want us, as we reflect on emancipation today, is to look at the contribution that every group, every ethnicity has made to our region. We have all been able, out of the gloomy past, to build something great. And if we are going to speak of a national consciousness, it must be written from that perspective. The contributions that we've all made to this nation and this region. I've said that to say it is not an issue of black and white. That is why I said when the story degrades to whether you have a white Jesus or a black one is immaterial. It is not a story of black or white. For all groups have contributed tremendously to what we are today as a people. It is not an issue of black or white either, because I believe that every, or most, or many, let me use many, Barbadian, indigenous Caucasian families, somewhere in them have some black relative. Look at us. How did we get here? We've all lived together and mingled over time. There is no need for separation. There is no need for division. We must now shape a national narrative that embraces the contributions of all. That embraces the contribution of our Eastern brothers and sisters, who made sure that many a time we could afford some of the things we had. Because as Colin Spencer said last night, he's not trusting anybody. The East Indians trusted a lot of us. Remember those days? The van coming around, and you take something this week, and you pay a little piece, and a little piece much later, and then a little piece much, much later, such that the saying came up, you wait, I can pay you back like how you pay. I didn't say it. I didn't say it. But you know what I mean. They have all contributed immensely to the development of who we are. And we must embrace each other. We must embrace the narrative. Sometimes it can be painful when we talk about it, but we must share it. Because our children must know what their story is. We cannot create a nation or a great nation built on hate. Neither can we create a great nation by sweeping things under the carpet. That is what the US tried and is beginning to show up. Because we knew only too well, for those of us who are following the story, after the election of Barack Obama, the number of hate groups in the US raised from 149 to over 1,000. The number of white supremacist groups moved from 690 to over 900. It was always there. Because they were living on a mythical history, a false narrative, rather than dealing with issues and embracing each other. Just 2 weeks ago, we celebrated the feast day of some freedom fighters, some women. 2 of them were slaves, Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. It was Harriet Tubman who once said, "I believe I'm entitled to 2 things in life, freedom and death. And if I can't have one, I'll take the other." She agitated for the abolition of slavery. And just a few weeks ago, there was a move to have her face placed on the $20 bill in the United States. And Steve King, that same representative I spoke to you about, he opposed it. That's what he had been fed. We cannot allow that to exist in our communities here. But even on a more communal level, on the level of our communities, we must teach our children, especially as people of African descent, I'm speaking to directly now, about the struggle, so that they learn to appreciate who they are in and of themselves. We are a people who have been specially preserved by God. The transatlantic journey, not many should have survived. Our ancestors survived it. The tyranny of slavery, not many should have survived. Our ancestors survived it. I have said that to say that every child born in this nation and this region must understand how special he or she is. And having gone through such a journey and understood such a journey, they will come to a greater appreciation of self and value each other. But what do we have taking place in our community now? After such a struggle, after God's divine providence, the children of slaves are now killing the children of slaves. The gun violence in our community, the children of slaves are killing the children of slaves. And why? Because many of them prefer enslavement to freedom. What do I mean by that? The scourge of drug abuse and drug addiction is a form of modern-day slavery, where our children become so dependent, so hooked, that they have no value themselves. They do not even understand who they are in the sight of God. And a lot of that comes because they did not understand the struggle in the first place. And then perhaps, on a more immediate note, tomorrow is Kadoomin Day. And we'll have a good opportunity to see how far we've come as a people, how we value ourselves, what we call culture. The Crop Over Festival, unlike many in our region, is set at a very interesting time. It always falls around Emancipation Day, the season of emancipation. And that is where carnivals were born. They were born out of the euphoria of our freedom. But when our young men and our young ladies perform some of the acts that we've seen on our roads in the past, Is that truly freedom? Or is that just another form of enslavement? A lack of value for self. A lack of understanding who we are. And so we think that our culture is take off something and pelt it away. I like the song, don't mind. But when it degrades to the level of persons not valuing their person, in an age of social media, of mothers and fathers not caring that their very children may see these things, and will have to deal with these images perhaps for the rest of their lives, it raises questions about our understanding of self and our understanding of freedom. And so as we celebrate Emancipation in this part of the world, we're all called to contribute to this national narrative, this national consciousness. For the Israelites, they believed that in order to build this national narrative and to create this consciousness, it had to begin at the micro level, in the home. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 6, we're told in the Shema chapter 6 and verse 4 and following, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. And remember the statutes and the covenants which I have given you this day. Teach them to your children and your children's children. Teach them when they're lying down and when they're waking up. Write it on your doorposts and on your gates, where it has front lights before your eyes." See, they understood that it had to begin at the level of family. And when we hide our story, when we hide our narrative, we're allowing our children to grow up without roots, without an understanding of self, without an appreciation of the struggle. When you do not appreciate the struggle, you tend to believe that all the privileges fell out of the sky. And what that does is that it puts future generations in jeopardy. Because if we cannot appreciate it now and understand the necessity to preserve the freedoms that we have, then there'll be nothing to pass to generations to come. So let us use this opportunity to start afresh, writing our national narrative, building our national consciousness, so that our children and their children may understand the value that they have, and may understand the beauty of the community we have created as a people in this nation. Varied ethnicities, varied religions, varied cultures, but as Queen Aziza said, one people, one nation. Let us pray. Almighty and ever-living God, we give you thanks for the freedom you have afforded us in this part of the world, for bringing us together as people of varied cultures, varied ethnicities. Though we have had a checkered past, to be able to see the greater good in each other. Help us even more to inculcate this good in our children and our children's children, so that our nation, our region, may grow from strength to strength and be a beacon in our world of the beauty of peace and security. And grant, Lord, that what we say with our lips we may believe in our hearts, and what we believe in our hearts we may show forth in our lives daily, for your name's sake. Amen.